Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, friends, wherever you might be listening to this podcast. Welcome to Pop and Politics. I am your host, Andres Bocanegra. This week, we take a look at the current political and cultural climate in the United States. The last 2+ weeks have seen mass demonstrations, calls for change, violence, police brutality, and a nation crying out for change. And for the first time in a long time, it truly feels like there is a significant shift in the national consciousness. But we also are a nation in need of leadership, and we will take a look at the president, who seems to be nothing more than a bystander, a tourist posing for a photo at a monumental time in our nation's history. This week, we will also talk about the need for all of us to come to a point where we recognize the need for a national reckoning on our history and our future. So let's get into it. This is Pop and Politics. All right, so let's dive into this week's topic. It was just over 2 weeks ago that this country was shocked by images of George Floyd being pinned to the ground by officers of the Minneapolis Police Department. As we know, Floyd had a knee to his neck and back for nearly 9 minutes, and ultimately lost his life as a result of a police action. It was devastating and became a rallying cry for the Black Lives Matter movement. In the 2 weeks since his death, there have been protests and marches right across the country and even the world. This truly American moment has caused other countries, most notably the United Kingdom, to confront their own historical racial injustices. But first, I want to take a look at what has happened over the last 2 weeks in order to provide some context, some of which we've spoken about in our last episode. On May 25th, George Floyd died after having an officer's knee on his neck, and his death sparked protests and unrest in cities across the nation. Demonstrators demanded police reform and justice to be served to the arresting officers. The next day, those officers were fired from the Minneapolis Police Department. Some of the protests that we've seen since initially began as peaceful protests, but escalated as a result of a number of different factors. Most notably among these is an escalation by police, who we have seen using less lethal crowd control devices like rubber bullets, pepper spray, mace, and other tear gases. So here's where I want to pause for a moment to give some extra context. It should be pointed out that what we know as tear gas is a collection of what are known as riot control agents that are used to disperse crowds by authorities. It should also be noted that gases like the ones used by police to control crowds are actually banned for use by the military in war. It is essentially it would be essentially a war crime if they were to be used by the military, and these are essentially classified as chemical weapons by the international community. They have been banned internationally since the end of World War I, but it should also here be noted that the United States didn't sign on to that agreement until the 1970s, nearly 60 years later. In 1993, the United Nations banned the development, production, or stockpiling of chemical weapons and required countries to destroy what they had. However, that 1993 agreement has an exception that allows law enforcement to use riot control agents for domestic purposes. So these escalation tactics that we've seen being used by police include batons or clubs to beat protesters, pushing and shoving them, and spraying tear gas or mace in their face as they walk away, tasing them while they sit in cars, shooting pellets of pepper spray, and other things that have just ratcheted up the tensions between the two sides. And at least one protester that I've read about in Ohio died as a result of being exposed to tear gas and pepper spray over the last 2 weeks, pointing to the fact that the use of these agents is much more dangerous than the public has been led to believe. And there's also been videos reportedly showing what have become known as provocateurs infiltrating these protests in order to provoke violence. And is that to say that all of them are provocateurs or all of the violence is because of provocateurs? No. But some of these theories of provocateurs have even been promoted by the President of the United States. Trump and company have called out Antifa and other groups, but have actually failed to mention any of the noted white supremacy groups who have been found to be connected to inciting violence during these protests. And there's several examples of that. But in recent days, the vast majority of the demonstrations and protests have appeared to be peaceful, and it seems that calmer heads have begun to prevail. Now, one of the most controversial moments happens over a span of a couple of days, starting on May 31st, when the president was taken to the underground bunker underneath the White House. The lights were turned off outside because of protests in nearby Lafayette Park. President Trump blasted the DC mayor for her handling of the protests and praised the Secret Service for their protection. But then days later, the president said on Fox News Radio that he wasn't taken to the bunker for protection, but instead was taken down for an inspection of the facility, which is just another in a series of moments where this president seems to peddle a story that is so nonsensical, all because he is scared to appear inadequate or weak or inept. But in reality, he appears laughably out of touch. In a time when the country is in the midst of protests over the murder of a black man and a global pandemic that has killed more than 106,000 Americans, the biggest concern for this president is that he doesn't appear weak. But this makes him not only look weak, but selfishly out of touch with reality. But the reason for that is simple. It's all he has. This administration has not handled the pandemic response well. It is not responding to these protests well. And despite touting a robust economy, this economy doesn't work equally for everyone and has been riddled by COVID-19. We've seen unemployment numbers like we've not seen since the Great Depression. And that's where we get this most bizarre moment. At the order of what appears to be the Attorney General, Bill Barr, peaceful protesters were cleared out of Lafayette Park with rubber bullets and tear gas, all so that the president could be seen as tough and strong, walking across the street as he's flanked by police with riot gear and shields, all to, hold up a Bible outside of the church nearby, looking like he's holding up his number at a local sandwich shop when his order is ready. Now, this president has long been a bystander in this game of politics. But especially now, when this country needs leadership the most, this president hasn't been there. He hasn't been in the pews of churches, especially in Minneapolis or Houston, to memorialize George Floyd. He hasn't spoken completely or publicly on the ways that George Floyd's death has shaken the very conscience of America. He hasn't tried to reconcile, and he has all but dismissed the notion of systemic racism in law enforcement and in this country. And he has put himself firmly on the side of police over protesters. He wants everyone else to take responsibility. He wants everyone else to take action. He doesn't want to take any ownership. And unfortunately, the majority of his party and his base seem to be perfectly fine with that. In the last couple of days, there have been a few cracks in that resolve of the Republicans and former White House senior staff, with Mitt Romney joining a Black Lives Matter protest, General Mattis coming out and speaking out against the president, and Colin Powell speaking out against the president and his danger to the Constitution and this country. But those cracks have not been enough. So, what does this moment call for? In my opinion, it's time for a national reckoning of our history and repositioning ourselves for the future. Donald Trump is not the only one who fails to see what the death of George Floyd speaks to, this larger issue. Instead of hearing the cry of Black Lives Matter as a call for reform and change, some people see it as an attack. And we hear it every time that someone responds back with "all lives matter." Now, I will own up to my own previous missteps here. There are times where I feel like the protester with the sign that I saw a photo of recently that read, "I'm sorry I'm late, but I'm here now." I was one who didn't fully understand this movement when it first came up years ago. When Colin Kaepernick kneeled during the national anthem, I didn't agree with that action. I acknowledged his right to do it, but I didn't agree with it. I didn't fully understand. But the more that I researched, the more that I listened, the more that I heard, the more that I saw correlations with my own experiences and history as a Hispanic and as a member of the LGBTQ community, the more that I understood. The more that I recognized the disparities that had played out all across our country. And this year, after the deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, there could be no doubt of the importance of the Black Lives Matter movement. Saying things like "all lives matter" doesn't acknowledge the struggles being faced by the Black community. Saying Black Lives Matter doesn't mean that other lives don't matter. And we've all seen the anecdotes on social media and in the news and that have made the rounds, and it's made it easier for some people to understand things and to talk about. Like, if your house is on fire and the fire department comes to put out the fire, saying "all lives matter" is like your neighbors being angry that firefighters aren't spraying their houses with water and shouting that "all houses matter." Or if you're raising money for a breast cancer charity and someone shouts you down by saying that "all cancers matter." While yes, those things are true, in the moment, the focus is on something in particular. And the same is true here. There has been a pressing need for some time to recognize that, and America seems to have finally woken up to it, myself included. The attitudes of Americans, particularly college-educated Americans, are changing very swiftly. No longer do we see Jim Crow laws as a shameful relic left behind in the 1960s. No longer are images of police brutality against African Americans seen as isolated or the result of rogue cops. And some will point out that moments of black on black crime exist. And that's true. But what are you doing to address it? Or that police brutality against white citizens is just another reason to not support these protests. But the question should be that if brutality upsets you, why are you not protesting against it? Where are you protesting and supporting the things that would address the problem, address those concerns? You know, protest is a fundamental right in our country. It is enshrined in the First Amendment. We have the right to, as citizens, to redress our government for change. If you see something that angers you or upsets you, protest against it. Protest for change. But don't waste that right to protest the government for not letting you get your hair and nails done, Karen. This has been a moment for Americans to really grapple with a hard reality. Not just about racial inequality and injustice for minority Americans, but for our very history. We've seen some states and communities commit to or remove statues of Confederate soldiers and leaders, notably the Robert E. Lee statue in Virginia. We've seen protesters topple statues of figures like Christopher Columbus, who is seen as a symbol of oppression for Native American populations. Protesters in the United Kingdom have toppled statues of slave traders, dumping them in the harbor. And we've seen companies and sports teams and organizations commit to serious conversations on racial injustice. Even NASCAR has banned the Confederate flag from its tracks. But of course, some of these actions are met by some with contempt or disagreement. And that's the nature of a free society. But to not recognize the history of these symbols as oppressive icons is to ignore historical context. Take the Confederate flag and monuments to Confederate figures. To display these icons in public spaces is to glorify a period of time of racial inequality. In the more than 150 years following the Civil War, Confederate monuments have been built in many states, some of whom weren't even in the Confederacy. And the peak of these monuments and these things being built was around 1910, some 50 years after the Civil War. And these aren't memorials to fallen soldiers. These are monuments. And so in 1910, during the height of the Jim Crow era, that was defined by segregation and disenfranchisement against Black Americans, these monuments go up. States like Georgia change their flag to be reminiscent of the Confederate stars and bars. And another spike comes in the 1950s and the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. These monuments and symbols were put up at times when supporters likely felt threatened by the growth of racial equality. But they also glorify a period and a group that openly opposed the United States. And they are most feverishly supported by those who consider themselves to be fervent, patriotic Americans. It makes no sense. Flying the Confederate battle flag, in my opinion, is similar to flying the Nazi German flag, or glorifying a country that the United States fought a war against. You don't see German communities in this country with statues of Adolf Hitler, because that would be wrong. The argument is that these symbols represent history, and in some regard, that might be true. But if your argument is that you want to have a robust discussion on history, these things belong in a museum where they can be presented in context and with context and detail, not in a city square. A public monument in a city square is not a piece of history. It exists solely to honor someone or something. It is a display of what we as a society honor or endorse. Flying the Confederate flag outside your home is not a piece of history. It says that you endorse the idea of the Confederacy. And don't be mistaken, the Confederacy stood for two things: the disunion of the United States and the official establishment of slavery based on race. That is historical fact. You can't say that you don't support racial injustice and racial inequality. You can't say that you are not racist or you don't believe in racism when you support keeping icons of the Confederacy around. But this debate should be more than just about monuments and flags. It should be about policing. It should be about access to healthcare, education funding, and more. The things that would make people more equal. With regard to education, despite the fact that racial segregation in education has been illegal for more than 65 years, American public schools remain largely separate and unequal. More than half of school children are in racially concentrated school districts, and school districts in this country are also largely segregated by income. This racial and economic segregation has intensified over time, and the gaps between rich and poor students and white students and students of color have grown alongside them. There are a lot of reasons for that. But that is part of the systemic racial inequality that needs to be addressed in this country. With regards to policing, the refrain from those who are not in touch with reality is that events like the one we saw with George Floyd that's just what happens with a few bad apples. But to use that phrase and exclude the rest ignores the whole story. It is the few bad apples that spoil the bunch. And when you look historically, the first law enforcement organizations in this country had their roots in returning runaway slaves to their owners. That's where you get things like the Underground Railroad. This goes back to 1704 and the colony of Carolina, which developed the nation's first slave patrol. And other historical police forces were created to protect communities, especially from Native Americans in places like New England or the frontier in St. Louis. Following the Civil War, the legacy of slavery and racism did not end. Violence against people of color became even worse with the increase of things like the KKK and vigilante groups who resisted Reconstruction and racial equality, up to and even including the 1920s and the destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa and the responses to the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, to the assassination of Martin Luther King. Today, law enforcement officers are armed to the teeth with multi-million or billion-dollar budgets and military-grade weapons. They are trained by some to believe that they are at war with the communities that they are meant to protect. But because of, and a result of, limited funding and cuts from government of social programs, Police are tasked with an at times overwhelmingly complicated set of duties that they may not be fully equipped to handle. Extreme funding of police departments has resulted in social programs getting less and less over time. We ask police to handle things like homelessness, mental health issues, and other community issues that could certainly be addressed in a much different way. Yet, in recent days, we've seen police drive their cars into crowds, beating people with sticks, gassing protesters, spraying pepper spray for moving vehicles like it's going out of style, and other instances of excessive force, which has done nothing but to exacerbate and escalate tensions. But these protests and the need for a national reckoning are a response to and a symptom of a broken system. Take a look at Minneapolis. The Minneapolis Police Department is 7 times more likely, or was 7 times more likely, to use force against black people than white people. Black Americans in this country as a whole are 2.5 times more likely to be killed in an interaction with police than white Americans. And you can ask yourself, how did we get here? In many cases, it was on purpose. We all had a hand in it. Initiatives to increase funding for police departments, hiring more police officers, the war on drugs, all of these things to avoid looking weak on crime. Funding the police at the expense of and cutting funding to social programs meant that over time, every societal failure or issue was put off on the cops to solve. Former Dallas Police Chief David Brown pointed out that not enough funding for mental health or drug abuse programs meant that additional responsibilities were left to the police to handle. And in many communities, the police are left as the only public resource. And there's a lot of things that can be changed with regards to policing. And hearing things like defund the police can certainly seem frightening. But don't be surprised to see our law and order president or his minions on Fox News use that to frighten the public. But this isn't an episode of Law and Order. This is America. This is society. But what has become this protest chant of defund the police really means that we need to take a look at the funding of police departments, the types of equipment that they can use, the tactics that they use, gun reform in this country, proper funding of education, and proper funding of community response programs for mental health and drug abuse. But we also need to focus on reforms of police unions and reforming qualified immunity for police officers. These reforms should be accompanied by policy change. We've seen it before. It's happened in Camden, New Jersey, with some success in rebuilding public trust and reductions in police brutality. But these changes will not be easy or fast. It will take a long time. And what it will take is sustained pressure. And for all of us to join Black and minority communities to ensure that their voices can be heard. And we know the recommendations. They've been made before. But as a country, eventually, time has bred inaction. And it is so critical of us now, for all of us to reckon with ourselves and with our society. We have broken the social contract with some of our communities. And it's time that we reckon with our past, recognize where we've made mistakes, atone for them, and push for meaningful and substantial changes. Our image in this world as a leader depends on it. If we ever want to be considered the greatest nation in the world again. These are things we need to take care of at home. All right, so that will do it for us this week on Pop and Politics. Again, very interesting topics to talk about this week, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to the show this week. We did take a week break in between last episode and this episode, just having to deal with some work from home issues and such, but we are back. We will be doing an episode hopefully every week. But thanks so much for tuning in this week. Certainly do appreciate it. Reminder, you can find us on Facebook and on Instagram, and you can also listen to the show on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and now on iHeartRadio. Simply search for Pop and Politics. Thanks so much for joining me this week. This has been another episode of Pop and Politics.